The diner was alive with the sound of clinking plates, the low hum of conversations, and the smell of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee. Yet in the middle of that ordinary afternoon, a single cruel act froze the room in silence. A group of teenagers, loud and arrogant, shoved their way past tables before stopping at the booth where a frail young woman sat. Her name was Clara. She had only one good leg, the other stiff and braced in metal from a childhood accident that had left her disabled. She was eating quietly, her cane propped against the booth. One of the boys, smirking with his friends behind him, leaned over, mocked her limp, and in a moment of shocking cruelty, slapped her across the face. The sound of that slap echoed like a gunshot in the room. Clara gasped, clutching her cheek, but before anyone could react, the boys laughed and swaggered out, leaving her trembling in shame and pain. And in that instant, the diner felt like a place where kindness had died. If you believe that kindness and second chances matter in this world, then please pause for a moment and hit like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Journal. Stories like this remind us how fragile hearts can be, and how much power we have to heal or to harm. Clara sat frozen, her fork trembling in her hand. She could feel every pair of eyes in the diner on her, and that attention hurt almost as much as the slap itself. People were staring, but no one moved. No one said anything. It was as if the shame had been passed to her, as if she had caused the scene, as if her very existence invited cruelty. She bent her head, hair falling over her face, and tried to keep eating, though her hands shook too badly to hold her fork steady. A tear slid down her cheek, mixing with the faint red mark of the slap. For years, Clara had lived in a world that wasn't built for her. Since the car accident that had taken her father's life and left her leg permanently damaged, she had learned to walk again with braces and a cane. She had learned to smile when people pitied her, to pretend she didn't hear the whispers when children pointed at her limp, to work harder than anyone else just to feel normal. But no matter how strong she tried to be, moments like this, raw, humiliating, brutal, reminded her how cruel the world could be. She thought of leaving the diner, but the thought of hobbling past everyone's eyes, struggling to carry her food and balance her cane, felt like too much. So she stayed, shrinking into herself, wishing she could disappear. The staff behind the counter muttered, shifting uneasily. A waitress named Marcy, kind-hearted but timid, whispered to the cook that someone should have stepped in. The cook, an older man named Howard, shook his head, muttering, not worth the trouble, those kids run wild around here. And so the silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, while Clara sat alone, broken-hearted in the middle of it all. An hour later, the bell above the diner door jingled again. This time, it wasn't a group of teenagers that entered. It was a rumble of heavy boots, leather jackets, and the unmistakable presence of men who carried themselves like storms. A group of bikers, 6 in all, walked in. Their jackets bore the name Iron Hawks, and their faces were etched with the weathered lines of men who had seen too much and survived worse. People instinctively tensed, bikers carried reputations like shadows, and everyone in that diner assumed trouble had just walked in. But Clara barely looked up. She had grown used to people, whether bullies or strangers, assuming the worst about her, and she didn't have the energy left to care about assumptions made about others. She just wanted to finish her cold plate of eggs and leave quietly, unseen. Yet fate had other plans. The bikers took a booth across the diner, their laughter deep and raw, their voices carrying like gravel across the room. One of them, a broad man with gray streaks in his beard and a scar across his eyebrow, noticed Clara struggling to cut her food with her shaking hands. He saw the fading red mark on her cheek, the cane leaning against the booth, the way the other patrons kept glancing at her and then looking away in shame. His laughter faded. He leaned toward the waitress and asked, "What happened here?" His voice was low, but it carried an authority that demanded honesty. Marcy hesitated, glancing around as if to see if anyone would stop her. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "A group of boys came in earlier. They hurt her." She nodded toward Clara. No one stopped them." The biker's eyes darkened. He exchanged glances with his brothers, and in that silent exchange, an understanding passed between them. Men who had grown up on the rough edges of life, men who had seen what cruelty could do, weren't about to let such a thing slide. They rose to their feet, their presence filling the diner like thunderclouds before a storm. The leader, the man with the scar, walked toward Clara's booth. She stiffened when his shadow fell across her table, her heart thudding with unease. But when he spoke, his voice was unexpectedly gentle. "Miss," he said softly, "may we sit with you?" The Clara blinked, startled. No one had ever asked to sit with her like that. She nodded slowly, and the bikers slid into the booth around her, their huge frames dwarfing the small space. The leader introduced himself as Mason, his brothers as Cole, Rex, Tanner, and two others whose names she barely caught. Mason looked her straight in the eye. "We heard what happened." His tone carried no pity, only steady respect. "No one deserves that. Ever." The Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to tell them it didn't matter, that this was her life, that she was used to it. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, tears welled up and spilled over, and she covered her face with her trembling hands. What happened next would stay in the memory of every diner patron that day. Mason gently took her hand away from her face and nodded to Marcy. "Bring her the best meal you've got." "On us?" His brothers chimed in, making jokes to lighten the mood, promising Clara she was sitting with the safest table in the whole state. Slowly, unbelievably, Clara began to smile. But the story didn't end there. The Ironhawks weren't content with comforting words. They wanted justice. They asked the waitress to describe the boys, and within minutes, Mason had one of his men outside calling friends. These bikers weren't saints, but they had their own code, a code that despised bullies more than anything. An hour later, word came back. The boys had been spotted loitering near the gas station down the street, laughing like nothing had happened. Mason and his crew stood, telling Clara, "Stay here. Finish your meal." They left like a storm breaking loose, their boots heavy on the diner floor. The diner buzzed with nervous anticipation. 15 minutes later, the bikers returned. The boys were not with them, but the smirks were gone from their faces. One of the bikers clapped Mason on the back, chuckling, "They won't be bothering anyone again. Let's just say they learned what respect feels like." He didn't elaborate, and no one asked. But everyone in that diner knew those boys had been taught a lesson they wouldn't forget. Clara sat stunned. For the first time in years, she felt what it was like to be defended, to matter enough for someone to stand up. She realized it wasn't about the slap anymore. It was about being seen, about someone refusing to let cruelty be the final word. Mason leaned toward her before they left and said, "Don't you ever think you're alone in this world. There's more good people out here than you know. You just met some of them." When the bikers left, the diner erupted in quiet applause. Not loud, not boisterous, but sincere. The cook who had once muttered, "Not worth the trouble," came over and comped her meal, his eyes lowered in shame. The other patrons, one by one, offered nods of respect. For Clara, it was as if a curtain had been lifted. She still had her limp, her cane, her battles. But in that moment, she also had proof that kindness was alive, fierce, and unafraid. If this story touched your heart today, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Kindness Journal. Let's remind the world that standing up for one another still matters. And before we end, I have a special request. Comment below with the words, "Kindness Lives," if you believe that defending the vulnerable is the truest form of strength. Clara never forgot that day in the diner, not because of the slap that stung her cheek, but because an hour later, a group of men who looked like outlaws proved to her, and to everyone watching, that the greatest rebels in this world are those who fight for kindness.